Alright, hi everybody. So let's talk about nonverbal communication. I've posted a video about nonverbal communication in another module called Amy Cuddy. She's a researcher who's been looking at nonverbal communication from a biological standpoint, and what she has to say is really interesting. So take a look at that. This was actually a Tumblr post from a linguist who studies body language, and it's more of a blog. We Speak Body Language, if you want to go take a look at it. And I really liked the way they put what body language is and what body language isn't. When we talk about body language, it's something that gets used a lot, and so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what linguists mean by body language. So body language is constant. You are always communicating, and there's never a time where you're not communicating. And people are reading you and judging you consciously and subconsciously, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Body language is always determined by context. Another way of saying that is that body language is always contextual within culture. There's a number of scenarios, as I'm sure you're aware, where body language is misinterpreted between cultures. And that happens all the time. So avoid making snap judgments just because you see someone cover their mouth, tap their foot, certain gestures. We've talked about gestures a little bit, right? How they can be misinterpreted, right? Gestures are arbitrary. One of those characteristics of language, right? They're learned. Congruency is one of those sections of body language that gets studied quite a bit. This is actually what people study when they learn how to tell if you're lying, because there are certain gestures, certain poses, way of holding our head. They are contextual. Again, they are usually cultural in origin, but knowing the culture allows you to, for example, the example here is a person saying I love you while shaking their head is incongruent. So therefore you can, through context, either say the I love you is supposed to be sarcastic, or they're lying. Right? So these are actually better termed microexpressions, and you've probably heard of those. Microexpressions are considered involuntary. They betray inner feelings. Again, they are contextual, meaning that they are cultural in origin. So someone from a different culture coming in and taking a lie detector test, for example, could pass it, because the lie detector test is, even though they're watching your heartbeat, they are asking questions that are contextual in origin. Knowing the culture, then the questions actually have meaning. Whether or not that should bother you or not is cultural in origin. And there's actually the YouTube video for body language, but I've also posted it on as a link. So there are these 5 major topics within nonverbal communication that I like to talk about. Kinesics, prosemics, haptics, paralanguage, and chronemics. We've talked about some of these kind of in passing, but I want to go through each one. kinesics. So body motion. Body motion communication, it's a better way of saying this. Body language isn't a super great term because it's not a full language in the way that you and I have talked about language in this course. So if we talk about body motion communication, we can talk about facial expressions, even tapping our foot, where we have our hands, how close we are to each other. Ray Birdwhistell, that's actually his name, coined the term kinesics and introduced it to linguistics in 1918. And he was actually someone that studied film through visual anthropology and actually looked at how actors determined what people should actually, how they should move from the script. Right? So he actually really developed this topic based on what actors think people should be doing in certain situations, because they have to actually consciously think about where they're placing their hands. For example, polysemic, right? Meaning that there are many different interpretations depending on context. So there's a word for you. Okay? And he modeled the system after structural linguistics. Interesting that created the term kineme. So like phoneme. And that way he could actually quantify movement by getting down to the smallest gesture that conveys meaning, just like a phoneme is the smallest amount of sound that contains meaning. Prosemics. Right? Spatial zones are sort of a prosemics. I would always think of prosemics as almost a sub-discipline of kinesics, because where you are in space has a lot to do with body movement. But I'm talking about just distance. For example, we have 5 spatial zones in Western culture specifically. And these, of course, then vary from culture to culture. Some cultures don't have certain zones. But in Western culture, we have the close, intimate zone, right? Mostly for spouses and for children. Other way around. The close, intimate zone, is for spouses, for children. Then the intimate zone is for family members. So think of it, the intimate zone and the close intimate zone, as the difference there being is touch. So if someone comes up to you and they're standing really close to you and that's fine, like a father, then that would be the intimate zone, right? But someone that comes up to you and is allowed to touch you without having to ask you ahead of time is someone that is allowed into your close intimate zone. A personal zone. Now, in these these ranges of about 1 foot to 2 feet is, that's a range within different Western cultures, right? I think I was talking in class about Germany, for example, right, where their personal zone is much closer than Americans' personal zone. Whereas Americans, if they get, close enough together, they have to make eye contact or at least acknowledge each other. Otherwise, it's considered rude. In Germany, people pass each other all the time, in the hallway and never say a word to each other. And they might, know each other really well, but they're not close enough to initiate conversation, for day-to-day interactions. In the public zone, in the social zone, business interactions, or the public zone, think more like, lectures, something that's really impersonal, where the people that you're speaking to are anonymous. You don't care particularly who's in the audience. That's the public zone. So here's a great graph. Right, and this is specific for American culture. But for Western culture in general, there are these 5 zones. They just, vary in range. And again, there are cultures that don't have a public zone because they're tribal, for example. So everybody that they know, that they've ever met, that have grown up with, is within that second circle, and so their culture just doesn't have that first outer circle. Haptics is literally the study of communication through touch. Okay? Every culture has a different perception of touch as communication. Every culture touches to communicate. Right? So, haptic communication, right? We can actually communicate meaning through touching, and haptic perception is something that's been studied quite a bit, especially through neuroscience, is the process of recognizing objects through touch, meaning that you can close your eyes and touch something. It's, like you're digging in the bottom of your purse, right? You're looking for your keys. You don't have to see your keys. All you have to do is touch them. Right? That's actually a function of your brain that is working between the memory centers of your brain and the touch centers of your brain. If you don't have that connection well established, then you can touch it all you want, but if you can't then connect it to a memory, you won't know what it is until you see it. So touching, especially as communication, is so vastly different around the world. Kissing is a really great example. Or meeting each other. Whether or not you touch each other, and what kind of touch. Latin America, for example, people greet each other with a kiss on the cheek. That's very common in Switzerland, in France, parts of Italy, even people that you don't necessarily know well. It's called a social kiss, and men do it as well as women. Shaking hands used to be very common in the United States. I'd say up until about the 80s. It stopped being super common, especially between friends. It's still common between strangers, obviously. And what's really interesting, in many countries, like Brazil, there's a difference on whether or not it's 2 men meeting, or 2 women meeting, or a man and a woman meeting. In Switzerland as well, for 2 women, you kiss each other 3 times, or right cheek, left cheek, right cheek. You don't do that to a man. Chronemics. The use of time. The way one perceives and values time. I think we've talked a little bit about this, but we will talk more about chronemics when we watch Arrival. And I want to wait to watch Arrival until I get back. 1, because it's one of my favorite all-time movies, and there's so much packed into that movie that relates to this course.